Okay, let's see what happens when we use JFLAP to build a Mealy machine. And this is actually a page from the JFLAP tutorial, just reminding us that big differences between a Mealy machine and a finite automaton. Mealy machine has no final states. When you take a transition, it produces output, and it doesn't have any final states because it doesn't really accept or reject input. It just creates this output. And it cannot be non-deterministic. Essentially, it has to be like a DFA, right? So let's take an example and build a new Mealy machine. And I'm going to build a very simple Mealy machine that just takes the alphabet 1, 0, just like in the JFLAP tutorial. I'm going to go into the state creator. I'm going to make a single state, and I'm going to make that my initial state. I right-clicked, right? If I right-click, if you look at this for a minute, there is no set as final state, right? Make it an accept state because there are none in Mealy machines. And of course, our transitions are a little bit different. So I'm going to click here to do a transition from Q0 to Q0. And when I see a 1, so this is the first part, this is the letter in my string, my output is going to be a 0. And now I will click somewhere else. And let's give it one more option, which is if I see a 0, my output is going to be, well, you know what? Let's say if we see a 1, we do a 0. But if we see a 0, we're going to output 2, just to make it a little bit more interesting. So if I see a 1, output a 0, but if I see a 0, I'm going to output a 2, okay? And now we can do the same kind of tests that we could do with regular NFAs and DFAs, right? So we can, go to the input menu and we can say, go by step. And I can say, let's do 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, and I'll say okay. And now I go into the simulation menu where initially these are all dark. I'm at state Q0 and nothing has happened yet. And if I say step, you'll see, you can't really see in the video, but this first one has gone gray. And because I saw a 1, I outputted a 0, right? And if we take another step, we see a 1, we output a 0. Now I see a 0, so we expect, look at that, it output a 2. We'll do another step, and we'll do another step, and we're done. I can also click on this and say, show me the trace, oops, which is all the way up here if I want to see it, right? Let's close out of that. Let's close out of the simulator. The only other thing I wanted to show you on here is that JFLAP is very nice in that it doesn't let me do non-determinism. No, let me just show you, I'm sorry. Of course, we can do a multiple run too, right? So here's some examples, and I can run it on these inputs, right? But as I was saying, you can't have any non-determinism in a Mealy machine or a Moore machine. So if I kind of make another couple states, and let's suppose that I say, well, let's have a 2 here just to make it interesting. And on 2, we'll print a 6. And I'm not going to build a complete machine here, but from Q1, if you see 2, we're going to print 3. But we're also going to have, whoa, exciting, right? From here to print 4. So there's my non-determinism, right? Because if I'm here, I do that. And if I'm here, I do that. And why don't we make one more state Q4, and let's say that this is, if you see a 5, print 7. So that's going out of Q0. Q0 is still okay, but I want to make Q4 non-deterministic. So let's say that Q4 goes to Q1. You'll see why I'm doing all this in a minute. And on 0, it prints 1. That way, but I can also go from here and on 0 print 7. Okay, so I have 2 non-deterministic states here that I made, right? Q4 goes to Q1 and Q2 on a 0, and also Q1 goes to Q3 and Q2 on a 0. If I try to test this, let's do a step thing. it complains, oh no, you have some non-deterministic states in here, and it says select menu item test : highlight non-determinism to see non-deterministic states. Isn't that nice? So if we go to the test menu and we say highlight non-determinism, it says look at that. Q4 and Q1 are my non-deterministic states. So I need to fix that before I can keep going. Let's just get rid of all of these guys. So again, this was our Mealy machine, right? Mealy machine has the output on the transitions. You've got my goofy mnemonic, right? So a Mealy kind of sounds like mean in the middle. So we think that the output is when you're in the middle between states on the transitions, whereas Moore machines have more output, right? They have more output. And so the output is on the states. The output happens when you get to a state rather than in between on the transitions. So let's make a new Moore machine. So here's our new Moore machine, and let's bring it down so you can see it. So I'm going to do a machine that is pretty much the same as our Mealy machine. Remember our Mealy machine, when it saw 1 output 0, when it saw 0 output 2 for no apparent reason, right? The only catch is when we make a Moore machine, as soon as it starts, on a start node, you have to have an output for each node, right? So just for fun, I think I'm going to have an exclamation point when we start. And let me just make this my initial node again. We don't have any final node options on our Moore machine because Moore machines are essentially the same as a Mealy machine in terms of the differences between Moore machine and a finite automaton, right? And again, this is a page from the JFLAP tutorial that just talks about the differences. So I want it to, what did my other one do? It had a 0 output when it saw 1 and a 2 output when it saw 0. So let's have 2 more states, and we'll have a state that outputs 0. And you can see every time I make a state, it asks me to set the output. So there's a state, and we'll have 1 more state that outputs a 2, right? Yeah. So here's another state, and we will output a 2 from this state. So let's do some transitions. So if I see a 1, I want to go to the state that outputs a 0. And if I see a 0, I want to go to the state that outputs a 2. And then let's just, if I'm already here at this state and I see another one, so I just clicked so I could make a loop, I stay here. But if I'm at this state and I see a 0, I want to go down to Q2. And if I'm at Q2 and I see a 0, I want to stay here. Oops, no. Let's switch to the, there we go, so that we can see my loop a little bit better. And if I'm at Q2 and I see a 1, I want to go back to Q1 so that I can print that 0. All right. So here's my Moore machine, and now as soon as it starts every time, it's going to print that exclamation point, and then it'll print the rest of my output. So for example, if we go to the input, and I'm just going to go straight to the multiple run since you know how test works these days. Sorry, how the step works, I think. And if I take these and I run my inputs, every time now I get this exclamation point at the beginning, right? And then all the 1s turn to 0s, the 0s turn to 2s, and so on, right? There's also the same highlight non-determinism in here as there is in Mealy machines. And you know, if I add, let's add another state. Oops, let's close out of the multiple run back in the editor. Let's add another transition from state Q0 to Q2 on 1. And if I try and run this now on multiple run, it will complain and say you've got to remove the non-deterministic states, right? So we can, well, we can test highlight non-determinism Look, that's the one with a non-deterministic state. And if we click on the get rid of stuff and we get rid of that one, then we can run it again. Awesome.